Hello and welcome to Buy the Book. I'm your host, Joe Hebert. Today we are going to continue our study of truth, justice, and leadership. And after doing a study of Machiavelli's Prince, we're going to have a couple episodes on the legacy of Machiavelli. We want to trace through the influence that Machiavelli had, not all of it, but some important aspects of it, before we start getting into a critique of Machiavelli and looking at alternative modes of thought. So today we're going to focus on capitalism. And it's an interesting focus here because we're doing political philosophy. I'm not an economist and I'm not going to try to give you lessons on economics. But when I was growing up around election time, there was a slogan that I heard constantly, and that was, what's this election about? It's the economy, stupid. Right? So that's just one example of how in modern times, politics and economics are very intertwined. And it's always been the case that economics is a major part of politics, that economic questions are one of the most significant things that political authorities and political theories have to wrestle with. But I would argue that part of the legacy of Machiavelli is this intense, not exclusive, but very intense focus on economics in the modern era. We saw in Machiavelli's Prince that he argues perhaps most fundamentally, literally fundamentally, the prince should found on the people. That is, his power should be based on his relationship with the people. And what do the people want? They want property as well as pleasure and protection. So those are the things the prince needs to offer the people. None of them detract from his consolidation of power. Quite the opposite. When he gives the people their property, their pleasure, and protection, that gives him a justification for doing anything that he needs to do to enhance his own power, including eliminating all of his enemies. So it's a key formula in Machiavelli's Prince. And we're going to come back to that today as we look at some other very important thinkers and people who have influenced our attitudes and our practices in the modern world. And we're going to see how the political theory itself became a basis of a new kind of economics. And the first stage in that is sort of culminates in what we have come to call capitalism. And capitalism as a term is interesting in one sense because, strictly speaking, it is an economic term. It's about a certain way of organizing economic affairs, but we instinctively and just repeatedly use it as a political term. So we think of our society as a whole as being a capitalist society or having a capitalist theory or ideology. And of course, in this context, the competing ideology or theory that tends to be pitted against it is socialism. So our next episode is going to be on socialism and the relationship of capitalism and socialism to each other and how they relate back to this formula in Machiavelli's Prince about founding on the people's attachment to property, and other principles that we find in Machiavelli's thought. So the first place we're going to look for the influence of Machiavelli is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes is an English philosopher, and we have his dates on the screen there. His most famous work is Leviathan, which he publishes in 1651. Leviathan is actually a persona from the Old Testament. It appears a couple times in the Old Testament. It's some kind of a giant sea creature. And we could talk about the theological significance of that. But suffice to say that Hobbes is one of the things we saw Machiavelli doing in The Prince, reinterpreting scripture in his own way. And the very title of Hobbes's book is a Machiavellian maneuver. He takes a figure from scripture, the Old Testament, and in essence, the theological meaning behind it in the Old Testament is that if God could create this gigantic sea creature which could crush, any human being or a group of human beings like nothing, and God created that, and He could destroy that at whenever He wants to. That's the massive, how far beyond us God is. So it's the greatness of God is what that's evoking in the Old Testament. And Hobbes does precisely the opposite in his book Leviathan. He argues that, first of all, he uses the term Leviathan as a name for the government. And he's going to teach, as we see, that government is a social construct. It's something that is invented, made, produced, and sustained by human reason and human choice and action. And so the Leviathan becomes a human construct, not a creature of God, but a human construct. And the Leviathan still has this awesomeness and this overwhelmingness, but Hobbes is saying that in essence, Hobbes is teaching we are our own saviors. We have to save ourselves through creating the Leviathan rather than taking the Leviathan as a symbol of God's greatness and authority and power over us. So there's a lot going on in this book, The Leviathan, but we're just going to look at a few little things here. First of all, one thing I would remark about Hobbes is that, in a sense, he's even blunter than Machiavelli about many of his teachings. Machiavelli implies over and over again that morality does not really exist. I don't think he ever says that explicitly, okay? Hobbes begins his book, and one thing to realize about Hobbes is that, unlike Machiavelli, who's writing for princes or other philosophers who are going to come after him, like Hobbes, for example, Hobbes is writing a little bit more like a textbook. So he's not writing for the general public, but he's writing for the teachers and the preachers, the people who are going to be teaching others. So he is trying to turn these Machiavellian ideas into more formulas that can be disseminated more easily in society. And that makes Hobbes very useful for seeing the logical structure of Machiavellian thinking, because he's very clear about it. On the other hand, from a Machiavellian point of view, I will note that this is probably a no-no. Machiavelli would say, look, you're supposed to be concealing these things. You're not supposed to be advertising them. And so as we go through Machiavelli's influence, I want to note that I think the better a Machiavellian somebody is, then the more they're going to hide it. And the fact that Hobbes advertises it so clearly is very charming in a certain kind of way to me, anyway, as a professor. But and it's very convenient. But I think it does, express one of the limitations of Hobbes's Machiavellianism. Whether he did this on purpose as kind of a sacrificial thing of, okay, Hobbes, like Machiavelli, was tagged as a bad guy, and nobody ever wants to call themselves a Hobbesian. But Hobbes still had a massive influence, nonetheless. So maybe it was a willing sacrifice, but in any case, it is kind of a limitation on the implementation of Hobbes's ideas. But he starts with, or at least we're going to start with, something early in his book, and he comes out and says what Machiavelli only implied, which is that the good, in the classical sense of the term good, is an imaginary thing, as Machiavelli implies. Hobbes says there is no such thing. He says it straight out. There's no finis ultimus, that's a Latin term, for the ultimate aim or ultimate purpose. There's no actual objective purpose to life. There's no summum bonum. There's no greatest good. And so Hobbes is like Machiavelli, blowing off the old moral philosophers. They're full of bunk. There's nothing useful. There's nothing applicable in them. Of course, like Machiavelli, he will borrow in a modified form all kinds of ideas from them. But his teaching about them is that they are bunk, basically. Now, as we'll see in classical thought, the goal, the ultimate aim, or the greatest good of human life is happiness. Felicity is another term in English. It basically just means happiness. So Hobbes basically is saying there is no happiness in the classical sense, but he goes on to redefine happiness. And against the same maneuver Machiavelli made in The Prince, saying that we're happy when we satisfy our desires. And Hobbes says felicity is the continual progress of desire from one object to another, the attaining of the former being still but the way to the latter. So in other words, we're happy when we satisfy our desires. We're unhappy when we don't. But Hobbes is being very blunt. Nothing will satisfy us for long. Once we attain the object of our desires, we're temporarily satisfied and then we want more. So Hobbes is very open here. Again, this is going beyond Machiavelli, because Machiavelli just wants us to know that the prince will be happy and the people will be happy. Now, does he suspect that, of course, this happiness is very temporary and limited in the way that Hobbes mentions? Yeah, he probably does, but he doesn't say that. It doesn't tell us this. But Hobbes actually comes out and tells us from the beginning, this is what I'm offering you. I'm offering you this, temporary satisfaction of desires. And this will lead to a desire for power after power that ceaseth only in death. In other words, eventually you're going to die and you're going to stop satisfying your desires. That's all there is to life. It's just a series of desires. If you're lucky, you could satisfy most of them along the way, and then eventually you hit a wall. So starting with a very bleak account of human affairs. But just like with Machiavelli, he's going to build on this. He's going to say if we accept this bleak picture, it's actually the key to achieving the happiness that we can achieve in life. Once we stop aiming at a false happiness, and we have to lower our standards, but then we can actually achieve it. And that's going to be sort of the selling point of most versions, if not all, of Machiavellianism, at least on the capitalistic side that we're looking at now, is that we lower our standards to realistic things, and then we can achieve them more abundantly. Now, where do we go from here? Hobbes readily admits that on this view of human nature, there's no good and no evil. Therefore, there's no just and unjust. He's very blunt about this. The notions of right and wrong, justice and injustice, have no place by nature. And he comes up with a construct that he calls the state of nature. I won't say too much about it in this very brief overview, but the state of nature is sort of an imaginary projection of what would life be like just based on raw human nature without the modifications of society and government. And it would be ugly, Hobbes tells us, because if there's no common power to keep us in awe, that's the Leviathan, the social construct. If we don't have a socially constructed system to hold ourselves in line, and that's, by the way, is the Prince, I should mention, Hobbes is writing, it's like rewriting the Prince from the people's point of view. So whereas Machiavelli is saying, okay, the Prince can make this offer to the people, I'm going to protect you, etc. Hobbes is saying, okay, people, what do you need? You need a prince, a Leviathan. But now the prince is a social construct. This is what the people have to basically make for themselves. They have to make this prince to protect them. But Hobbes openly teaches that virtue and vice are social constructs. So in a state of nature, force and fraud are virtues because they enable us to get what we desire. But of course, they're not going to be successful in a state of nature, and that's going to be the key to Hobbes's design, how he uses this foundation to build a government. Because in this state of nature, a war of all against all, as he calls it, nobody can win. Nobody is smart enough or strong enough to defeat every other person on the planet. So in this war of all against all, everybody loses. So it's an ill condition, Hobbes says. Now, what can we do about this? That's our nature. And just like with Machiavelli's conquest of fortune, we'll see in these Machiavellians, there's always some version of that conquest of fortune. Nature becomes a negative standard. By nature, we have this war of all against all, and it's no good for anybody. So we need to escape from nature. And there's part of our nature that can help us, but how does that happen? He says there's two parts of our nature, reason and passion. So from the passion point of view, the part that can help us escape is we want peace. We're afraid of dying. We're afraid of violence. No matter how strong and smart we are, we're going to die violently in the state of nature, and we're afraid of that. So we can take advantage of that fear to motivate us to escape. But then reason, how is reason going to help us to get out? He says reason can suggest convenient articles of peace. And this is where we're going to get the Leviathan. We can agree to uh, surrender ourselves to the government, to the prince, to the Leviathan, who is going to have power over us. Why would we want to do that? Because we have to protect ourselves from each other. None of us individually can achieve our desires in this condition of nature. So we have to agree to create an artificial condition where we are obligated to obey the government. And in doing so, we rescue ourselves from the feudal condition of not being able to satisfy any of our desires. So for Hobbes, right and wrong are don't exist by nature. And here we find, I think, a contradiction, a logical contradiction in Hobbes's thought. He tells us that by nature there's no right and wrong, but then he goes on to define natural right and natural law. Now, natural right and natural law are classical philosophical theories. And Machiavelli, of course, never talks about that. And that's very consistent of Machiavelli because he doesn't believe in the foundation of natural law or natural right. But Hobbes does. And it's a maneuver that I think is completely self-contradictory. There's no right and wrong by nature, but by nature we have certain rights and we have certain obligations. You literally can't actually believe both of those statements, right? But it's one of the signs of Hobbes's Machiavellianism. Because remember, Machiavelli says, I don't care about the truth, I care about the effectual truth. And so the effectual truth is, I would call this a certain mythology that Hobbes is constructing. And let's take these classical notions of natural law and natural right, let's just rework them into something that fits the Machiavellian paradigm. So people will now reinterpret justice in a Machiavellian kind of way. So how do you do that? Well, here's how he does. He says that what is commonly called the jus naturale, the natural right, is the liberty each man has to use his own power as he will himself for the preservation of his own nature, that is to say, of his own life, and consequently of doing anything which in his own judgment and reason he shall conceive to be the aptest means thereunto. So you notice how he keeps saying his own, his own, his own over and over again. This is a very radical theory. We don't have time to dissect just how radical it is, but it's radically subjective. Justice is simply my own right to do anything that I think I may have to do to survive. And it's very important for him. And he goes on to say there's a law of nature where I must do anything that I think I need to do to survive. So between the two of those, the right and the obligation, I'm driven to do anything. In the state of nature, that creates chaos. But what that does in under the social contract, when we agree to obey the government, this is crucial because our right to survive and our obligation to do whatever it takes to survive gets blended into that artificial construct, because I realize the only way I can survive is through law and order. And so I have not only a right to be, protected by the government, but I have an obligation to obey the government because it protects me. So Hobbes is tapping in to our selfishness, and he says this selfishness, if we just have unadulterated selfishness, we can make that the foundation of society, and it will be foolproof because nobody's going to want to die. Nobody's going to want to let go of their security and protection. And he ties it also to the enjoyment of property. It's important to see that because he does not emphasize it nearly as much as some later Machiavellians will emphasize it, but he does, in fact, bring it up repeatedly. So it's there. It's part of his argument that we saw in the earlier quotation, that we cannot enjoy the fruits of our labor, our property, our possessions, and things like that, unless there is law and order. And this is one of the selling points that Hobbes is using. We can satisfy desires within the system of law and order. We will be restrained. Obviously, we're not going to be allowed to hurt each other. But the benefit of that is that we get to accumulate property. We get to do all kinds of fun stuff. within a secure framework. And that is the formula that Hobbes thinks will make the vast majority of people happy to be obedient, which will therefore make the government, the Leviathan, all powerful. It will have the obedience of practically everyone, and it will have the support of almost everybody when it has to destroy any threats to the system that it is founded on the people. And next we come to John Locke. Locke is about a generation plus after Hobbes, and one of his major works on political society is the Second Treatise of Government, published in 1690. Okay, and I will start by noting that it is controversial among scholars today to regard Locke as a Hobbesian and therefore indirectly as a Machiavellian. And I'm not going to spend time on that controversy, the arguments back and forth, but I do want to call attention to some of the main features of Locke's thought, and we'll see how they connect to Hobbes and also how they connect to Machiavelli, even where Locke departs from Hobbes in certain things. I believe that he's being more Machiavellian than Hobbes in certain very significant ways. And it's also important to note that Locke, of course, unlike Hobbes, who is simply regarded as a bad guy, like Machiavelli, almost in all cases, nobody ever wanted to come out and be a Machiavellian or Hobbesian, openly. But Locke, I would argue, is one of the most successful Machiavellians because he still to this day, has a very large following. And it's just like Machiavelli was afraid to talk about Moses, because of what people believed about Moses in his day. And today, it's if we regard Locke as a Machiavellian, then we're gonna have to get in lots of fights about that. But let's just take a look and see what is going on in Locke. Now, one of the things that Locke does, and I think it's a very shrewd maneuver, where Hobbes had said, by nature, there's no right and wrong, and then contradict himself, and there's this law of nature and a right of nature, but they're purely selfish. He emphasizes how selfish they are. And then from that, through the social contract, we turn that into a kind of a common good because we all selfishly cling to law and order for our own selfish purposes. Now with Locke, I think Locke is essentially doing the same thing, but he's very careful not to advertise that, not to emphasize that at all. So he talks about how in the state of nature, there is a moral law, and he doesn't, contradict himself on this. He doesn't say, oh, there's no right and wrong, but there is right and wrong. He just says, no, there's a moral law. And when he articulates that moral law, he makes it sound moral. But if we look carefully at what the law is, now later when we look at classical thought, if we put this side by side with Thomas Aquinas, we would easily see that this is much more inspired by Machiavelli and Hobbes than by Aquinas, for example. But even if we just look at it as is right here, what does he say? It's that by the law of nature, we're bound to preserve ourselves. Okay, now Hobbes emphasized that's it. That's all there is. Just preserve yourself at all costs by any means necessary. Don't care at all about anybody else by nature. Locke says rather, we preserve ourselves, and by like reason, when our own preservation comes not in competition, we ought as much as we can to preserve the rest of mankind, and may not, unless it be to do justice on an offender, take away or impair the life, or what tends to the preservation of life, the liberty, health, limb, or goods of another. So he adds this provision that, by nature we're bound to preserve ourselves, protect ourselves, and as much as possible preserve everyone else and respect everything that preserves them, right? Don't take anything away from them that they need. But if we think about this strictly, we look at it very strictly, he is saying that we have an obligation towards others only when it does not compete with our obligation to ourselves. So in any condition where our own survival depends on depriving somebody else of their survival, or the means of our survival depends upon depriving somebody else of the means of their survival, automatically we prefer our own survival. That's simply what he's saying, just taking it at face value. He just doesn't emphasize that. He lets us, hear the words about how we should help other people, and it sounds really nice. But the flip side, the way he's putting it, is only when it doesn't interfere with our own. And when he talks about the state of nature, he argues, contrary to Hobbes, that the state of nature is not necessarily a state of war. It all depends on how people behave. But then he comes around and he admits that the effectual truth is that in every possible case, the state of nature will turn into a state of war. And why is that? Because the law of nature that we are looking at right here is in the state of nature is only enforceable by each individual. So in other words, I'm the only one who can enforce the law to protect myself. I can enforce it against everybody else in the state of nature. But Locke knows that people are not trustworthy judges in their own case. Now think about this. In society, if I had a gripe with my neighbor, would I be, could I say that I should be the judge in my dispute with my neighbor? Or would I be comfortable letting my neighbor be the judge in the dispute with me? Obviously not. We need a third party, some neutral party. And Locke mentions this, and he says, therefore, every little disagreement in the state of nature is guaranteed to turn into a war, because even if, let's say I know that somebody has a just grievance against me and they want to punish me, I cannot trust them to punish me fairly. I can't just say, okay, I'll take my punishment, because the chances are they're going to hurt me much more than I deserve. So I have to protect myself. So in other words, in every single case, my preservation will be in competition with the preservation of others. So Locke makes it look nice compared to Hobbes, but the logic ends up being exactly the same. In the state of nature, we are forced to be at war with each other, and we therefore need the social contract to make peace. And it is, an artificial construct of humankind, which is transferring the authority to this artificial construct, the government. But I would like to focus on Locke's teaching about property, because Hobbes mentions significantly that the social contract, obedience to law, enables us to enjoy property and possessions. But Locke makes this actually the central focus of his teaching about government. He actually argues that property, the protection of life, liberty, and property, which he will encapsulate in the term property, is the purpose of government. That's why we have government, is to protect property, which includes life and liberty, but with property being the central concept. Okay, so what does he mean by property, and why is that so important? We are really getting here, I think, to the foundations of what we call capitalism, which really goes back to Machiavelli's Prince, chapters 15 and 17. But chapter 5 of Locke's second treatise is where it's really being developed into an articulate theory that we're going to get a glimpse of here in this quick summary. So Locke begins with the idea that God has given the world to us in common for our preservation and convenience, but the way he's given it to us is that we have to appropriate things. That is, we have to, labor in such a way to be able to utilize the things that he has given us. So he's setting up a contrast here between God and nature on the one hand, the spontaneous hand of nature, as he puts it here, the things that are just there without our effort, and this comes from God and nature. And then on the other side is our labor, or the input that we have to put into this. So there's nothing, I would say, from a classical point of view, there's nothing objectionable about this so far. It makes sense that, Locke is saying that, we wouldn't be able to possess anything if we didn't exist, if things didn't exist. They have to be there. But then we have to provide input. We have to work on them. We have to labor in order to get them into a form that we can utilize for our needs. And this is the root of property, according to Locke. So it's all very reasonable, but let's see where he's going to go with this. So next, he kind of reiterates what he had said, but he puts it in stark terms. He says, God, when he gave this world to us, he commanded us to labor, and the penury of our condition required us to labor. So there's a harmony between God's commandments and nature, our natural reason, what we can see for ourselves. That also kind of sounds like classical thought. As we're going to see, faith and reason are harmonious in classical thought. So the things God commands are reasonable. The things reason commands are compatible with divine law. There's no contradiction between them. There's a good reason for having both. They supplement each other, but they don't contradict each other. But I think Locke is steering this in a somewhat different direction, and part of the clue to this is the term penury, which means poverty. So he's using a pejorative term now for what God has given us. God has given us the whole world, but at the same time, he's given us poverty because the world exists in such a shape and form that is not useful to us. We would, die in nature unless we did a lot of work to make it, suit our needs. And so when reason commands that we subdue the earth, that we, take control of things, it's because of this, this negative lesson that nature is useless to us, and in fact, downright harmful in many cases. And this is what God has given us, right? So we can start to feel a little bit of this antagonism. And remember Machiavelli's Prince, the virtue is the opposite of fortune. Fortune is relying on chance. Virtue is taking control of things for ourselves. And this is exactly where Locke is going to go with this distinction between God and nature on the one hand, which is poverty, and then wealth and property are going to come from human labor. So the next part, this is where we see Locke is departing from any kind of a classical view on this, and he's getting into Machiavellian territory. So let's watch carefully what he does. And he does it ironically with a quotation from Scripture. But I wouldn't say it's a misquotation, but it's a very misleading quotation from Scripture, which is one of the clues that he's leaving us to what he's up to. Just like Machiavelli had reinterpreted Moses and reinterpreted David, Locke is going to reinterpret, in this case, St. Paul, when it comes to money and property and the role that they play in our lives. So he quotes 1 Timothy 6:17, God has given us all things richly to enjoy. And he says, this is the voice of inspiration, of divine inspiration, of revelation, and it accords with the voice of reason. So his thesis is a good classical thesis that faith and reason are in unison. But here's what he does with it. He says the only limit on how much we can acquire and enjoy, the only limit, and if you look through chapter 5, this is literally the case, the only limit that he places on the acquisition of property and the use or enjoyment of property is spoilage. So he says if you're acquiring something and appropriating it to yourself, but you can't use it and it's going to spoil in your possession, then you are in essence robbing other people of this, and there's a moral fault there. One thing to notice about that, though, is what would be your motive in doing that, right? I mean, it's not wealth anymore if it spoils. So if you acquire things that are going to spoil, you're not actually even acquiring wealth anyway. Also, I'll note in passing that the solution for this problem is money. And money is another human construct. So just like with the social contract being a human construct that saves us from the ugliness of nature, money is a human construct that saves us from the spoilage problem, because now I can acquire things that will spoil, but I can sell them for money which will not spoil. And so I don't have this problem anymore that I'm not depriving other people because they can buy it from me, and also I'm not accumulating things that are going to be useless to me. So there's a spoilage limitation, but no other limitation. In fact, Locke is going to say that precisely because of that spoilage problem, and because of the solution of money, what it means is people who want to accumulate vast amounts of wealth are going to have to produce things that they can sell to other people. And therefore, they are going to increase the total wealth of society because it's human productivity that actually creates value or creates wealth. And the more we labor and produce things, then the more wealth there is in the world. But we'll get to that in a minute. And that's where he's going with it. Unlimited acquisition is a good thing, not only for the people doing it, but for society as a whole. But how does this compare to what St. Paul actually said in the passage that Locke is quoting? Well, if you look at St. Paul's statement that God has given us all things to enjoy, is he calling attention to the wonderfulness of accumulating property and as much as you can possibly accumulate and enjoying that as much as you can? No. In fact, I would almost be tempted to say the opposite, although strictly it is not the opposite. His argument is a kind of golden mean or classical virtue argument of a certain balance. But it is not the unlimited acquisition, and you can clearly see that in the context. First of all, St. Paul begins by saying that we should be content with the necessary goods in life. We should not be trying to acquire things that we don't actually need beyond our needs. Locke goes from poverty and starvation to unlimited acquisition. He never finds anything in between that where we could rest and be content. But St. Paul says, yes, we need to be content with a reasonable amount of material goods. And he says, those who desire more than they need, they fall into temptation, the snares of the devil, and their desires are unprofitable. In other words, they're not going to achieve happiness by having more. They think they can be happier that way, but they won't. It will lead to unhappiness. It leads to destruction and perdition. And he actually says this desire for money, which Locke says is the solution to the whole problem. Like money, once we have money, then we're good. We can just accumulate unlimited amounts of money, and that's a benefit for everybody because we're being productive. And St. Paul says, however, this desire for money is the root of all evils. And it leads, people into many sorrows. Now, what is the solution for St. Paul? This is really crucial. He appeals to the classical virtues: justice, godliness, faith, charity, patience, mildness. This is the classical teaching that happiness comes through virtue. It doesn't mean that money and material goods have no value. It means that their value is subordinate. Their value is a means to an end, and the end is a virtuous life. But a virtuous life does not require vast amounts of money and material goods. So the desire for vast amounts is a sign that we're on the wrong path and we're not aiming for what is truly good. That's the classical teaching. We're going to see that Plato, Socrates, that's what they teach, as well as Christ, St. Paul, Thomas Aquinas. This is what the classical philosophical and theological traditions have to say. And so it's in this context that St. Paul says, do not be high-minded or proud about your wealth, because the wealth that you have comes from God to enjoy within this limited framework. Okay, it's not something to brag about or be proud about or to be obsessed over. But this, Locke, obviously knowing where he took this quotation, he's doing exactly the opposite of what St. Paul is saying here. He's saying, yes, let's make it the focus of our lives to accumulate as much as we can. So finally, I can't resist this last quotation, because Locke, in making this argument, is clearly thinking about what Machiavelli had said in The Prince, that the people care most about property, and that if you protect their property, protect them and their property, they're going to be happy. Well, Locke has now come up with a formula to make political life all about not only protecting property, but accumulating more and more and more of it. So he looks back to The Prince, and he says, that prince who shall be so wise and godlike as by established laws of liberty to secure protection and encouragement to the honest industry of mankind, against the oppression of power and narrowness of party. So notice that other Machiavellian aspect. We're going to protect the people in their acquisition of property, but we're also going to protect the people from oppressors. Those are the two elements of the Machiavellian prince's power, that he protects the people from oppressors, and that authorizes him to use violence in whatever he needs to do. And he does that so that people can enjoy their property. And Locke says if the prince does this, he is wise and godlike, and he quickly be too hard for his neighbors. In other words, he will become much more powerful than other princes because of this policy. But this, by the by, this is like a parenthetical remark. Why does he include this at this stage in the book? And I think he simply is acknowledging where he got this idea. He didn't come up with it on his own. It comes from Machiavelli's Prince. There's much more we could say about John Locke and his whole system of thought and the influence that it has had on the world, including on American government, which clearly had a major influence. But to wrap this up, we're going to turn to one last thinker in the line of the development of the theory of capitalism, and then come back in the next episode and look at how that relates to further developments, particularly the development of socialism. So the last thinker we're going to look at here is Adam Smith. Now, Adam Smith is, his name is pretty much synonymous with capitalism, so I don't really have to explain the connection too much anymore. Smith's most famous work, The Wealth of Nations, is published coincidentally at the same time with the founding of the United States of America. And Smith, by the time Smith is writing this, you can see the Lockean idea that the primary purpose of political society is to help us accumulate wealth has become so influential that he is writing this huge scientific treatise on the wealth of nations. How is this to be done? And it's political economy, so it's not just like pure economics. It's looking at in the political context, but it's very much on the paradigm that politics is largely about the maximization of the accumulation of wealth. And so there's so many things, obviously, that we could look at in the Wealth of Nations, and the different concepts that go into this. But I just want to pick one so we can see the continued sort of fingerprints of Machiavelli and the way that over the centuries here we're developing this idea of what we're up to in political society. So there's a very famous passage in The Wealth of Nations where Smith is reflecting on how we treat one another in society, and particularly how it is that we need one another. He says, unlike animals who, for the most part, have very limited need of one another, they're equipped to do what they need to do by nature. Human beings are pretty much the opposite. We constantly need help from other people. The clothes we're wearing, the food we eat, everything that we have, somebody else is making and making it available to us. Even the language we're speaking, of course, we don't make up individually. So there's so many ways that that's true. And this, by the way, is one of the reasons why economics, develops as part of ethics or moral, philosophy, because it's about the way that we interact as human beings to help one another rather than hurting one another. And that's kind of the foundation of what economics is all about. But, goods and services, for example, not crimes and, injuries and hopefully. So it's a very moral topic, and Smith does, in fact, moralize about it. But as he's moralizing about it, he makes a very striking point, which is a very Machiavellian point. He says that when we need, the help or of another person, how do we obtain it in the most effective way? Is it by appealing to their charity, their benevolence? And he says, no, we wouldn't get very far in life simply by begging. Just imagine how much you're going to get simply by beggars tend to be poor, right? So if we're going to have a decent amount or a large amount of goods, how can we obtain that? We need help from other people, but we obtain it by appealing to their self-love, to their self-interest. We bargain with people. And what is a bargain? I'll do this for you if you do this for me. I'll give you what you want. You'll give me what I want. And he says this is the foundation of economics. And this is the foundation of really, flourishing and happiness in society. He uses the example of the butcher, the brewer, and the baker. Why did they do what they do to feed us? It's not out of benevolence. They're not operating a charity to keep us, from starving. They're doing it to make a living. And so he is downgrading the classical virtues of generosity and charity by arguing that they don't really get much done in the world. And what really gets things done in the world is selfishness, but a mutual selfishness where I will help you if you help me is a much more powerful engine of prosperity and happiness for people. Now, if we analyze this from a classical point of view, as I did in one of my blog posts, then we can see that there is no need to resort to this Machiavellian, binary, that you're either being benevolent and charitable and just giving things away, or you're being selfish and expecting people to pay you for things. This would actually be a false dichotomy from a Socratic or classical point of view. I do have a post which I'll link to where I went through that, and we can come back to that briefly in the next episode as we move on to look at the response to capitalism in the modern world, and particularly the socialist response to capitalism, and how both of these things relate back to Machiavelli and his ideas.